The cold bit through every layer I wore, turning my breath into clouds that hung in the air before disappearing into the grey December sky. The Ardennes forest stretched endlessly around us, a maze of snow-covered pines and frozen ground that crunched beneath our boots. It was December 16th, 1944, and I was Staff Sergeant James Mitchell, leading a small reconnaissance unit deep in the Belgian countryside. We'd been told the Germans were on their last legs, that this sector was quiet. Command said we'd be home by Christmas. They were wrong. The forest had an eerie stillness that morning, the kind that makes every sound feel too loud. My squad, 8 men who'd become brothers through months of fighting across France, moved in a loose column behind me. Private Danny Morrison walked closest, his rifle held ready, his young face tense with the alertness that kept soldiers alive. Corporal Frank Hayes brought up the rear, scanning our flanks with practiced eyes. We'd learned to trust each other's instincts, to read the subtle signs that meant danger. "Sarge, you hear that?" Danny whispered, stopping suddenly. I raised my fist, and the column froze. Silence pressed in around us, broken only by the distant sound of wind through frozen branches. Then I heard it, a low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once, growing louder with each passing second. The ground beneath my feet began to vibrate. "Artillery," Frank said, his voice tight. "Lots of it." The first explosion hit a quarter-mile to our east, sending a column of fire and smoke into the sky. Then another, closer. Then a dozen more, a rolling barrage that turned the peaceful forest into hell. Trees splintered and flew through the air. Snow vaporized in superheated blasts. The carefully maintained German positions we'd thought were abandoned suddenly came alive with movement. "Fall back!" I shouted over the chaos. "Back to the command post." We ran through the forest as the world exploded around us. Shells landed with earth-shaking force, throwing up geysers of frozen dirt and shattered wood. I could hear the screams of other units caught in the open, the rattle of machine gun fire as German infantry began their assault. This wasn't a localized attack. This was a full-scale offensive, launched with the element of complete surprise. Private Tommy Walsh stumbled beside me, his face pale with shock. "They said the Germans were finished. They said, keep moving." I grabbed his arm, pulling him forward as a shell landed where he'd been standing moments before. We made it back to our defensive line just as the fog rolled in, a thick white blanket that reduced visibility to yards. The Germans used it like a weapon, emerging from the mist in white winter camouflage that made them nearly invisible until they were almost on top of us. Our company dug in along a ridge overlooking a small village, maybe 100 men against what sounded like an entire division pushing through the forest. Captain Richard Sullivan found me as I was positioning my squad. His normally composed face was creased with worry, his eyes scanning the fog-shrouded tree line. "Mitchell, I need you to understand how bad this is. Communications are down across the entire sector. We've got German armor breaking through everywhere, and we're cut off from regiment." "What are our orders, sir?" "Hold this position as long as possible. There are artillery batteries 2 miles back that need time to displace. If the Germans get through here, they'll roll right over them." He paused, meeting my eyes. "We might be looking at days, not hours." The first German assault came an hour later, materializing out of the fog like ghosts. We opened fire, our rifles cracking in a ragged volley that dropped the leading figures. But more kept coming, and behind them came the distinctive clank and rumble of tanks. The sound of those engines sent ice through my veins. We had no anti-tank weapons, nothing that could stop armor. "Panzers!" someone shouted, and I saw them emerge from the mist, massive Tiger tanks that dwarfed anything we had. Their guns swiveled toward our positions, and I dove into my foxhole just as the world erupted in fire. The shelling was methodical and devastating. They'd fire, wait for us to pop up to return fire, then fire again. Men disappeared in direct hits, their foxholes transformed into smoking craters. The screams of the wounded cut through the constant thunder of explosions. I fired at shadows in the fog, never sure if I was hitting anything, just trying to keep the Germans from overrunning us. Night fell early in December, and with it came temperatures that plummeted below zero. The battle continued in darkness, lit by muzzle flashes and burning vehicles. My fingers went numb inside my gloves. Danny huddled beside me in our shared foxhole, shivering violently despite every layer he wore. "I can't feel my feet, Sarge," he said through chattering teeth. "Keep moving them. Don't let them freeze." I shared what little food I had, a frozen chocolate bar that we had to chip pieces off of. "We'll get through this." But I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. By dawn on the second day, our company had been reduced to maybe 40 men. The Germans kept coming, wave after wave, pushing us back yard by bloody yard. The village below us fell, and we retreated to a secondary line on higher ground. German artillery pounded us constantly, giving no respite, no chance to rest or warm ourselves. On the third day, ammunition began to run critically low. Captain Sullivan gathered the remaining squad leaders in what had once been a barn, now just a burned-out shell offering minimal shelter from the wind. Division says reinforcements are coming, but they're stuck fighting their own battles, he told us, his voice hoarse from shouting orders and breathing smoke. We've got maybe 2 magazines per man, a handful of grenades, and 1 bazooka with 3 rounds. That's it. And the Germans? Sergeant Kowalski asked. They've got everything. Armor, artillery, fresh troops rotating in while we're stuck here freezing. Sullivan looked at each of us in turn. But we hold. Those artillery boys got out because we held. Now there are medical units pulling back through this sector. We hold until they're clear. That afternoon the Germans launched their biggest assault yet. It started with a barrage that lasted 30 minutes, shells falling so thick that the air itself seemed to be burning. Then came the tanks, at least a dozen of them, supported by what looked like a full battalion of infantry. We fought with everything we had. The bazooka team took out 2 tanks before a shell landed directly on their position. I emptied magazine after magazine at the advancing Germans, watching them fall but knowing more would take their place. The man next to me, a kid from Iowa whose name I'd never learned, took a round through the throat and died choking on his own blood while I kept firing. The Germans reached our line in a dozen places. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted in foxholes and trenches, brutal close-quarters combat with knives, rifle butts and desperate fists. I clubbed a German soldier with my empty rifle, then dove for his dropped weapon as another came at me. Frank appeared from nowhere, tackling the German and ending the fight with quick, efficient brutality. "We can't hold," he shouted at me. "We need to fall back." But there was nowhere to fall back to. Behind us was open ground, a killing field where the German tanks would slaughter us. In front was certain death. We were trapped. That's when I saw the fuel depot. The Germans had set up a supply point in the captured village below, including what looked like dozens of fuel drums stacked near a destroyed church. If those went up, the resulting explosion and fire would catch the German forces massed for their next assault. It might give our survivors a chance to escape in the chaos. "Cover me," I told Frank, then started running before he could argue. I zigzagged down the slope, bullets kicking up snow around my feet. A machine gun opened up from my left, rounds buzzing past like angry hornets. I dove behind a burned-out Jeep, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. 50 yards to the fuel depot, 50 yards through hell. I pulled my last grenade from my belt, said a prayer I wasn't sure anyone would hear, and ran. The world became a tunnel, narrowing down to just the fuel drums ahead and my legs pumping beneath me. I heard shouting in German, felt the impact of a round hitting my pack, spinning me partway around. But I kept going, driven by the desperate knowledge that this was our only chance. 20 yards. 10. I pulled the pin on the grenade as I ran, cooking it for 2 seconds before hurling it at the base of the fuel drum stack. Then I threw myself flat behind a stone wall as the world exploded. The blast wave hit like a physical force, lifting me and slamming me back down. Heat washed over the wall so intense I felt my exposed skin blistering. The roar was deafening, drowning out everything else. Through the stone beneath my chest, I felt the vibration of secondary explosions as drum after drum went up, each one feeding the growing inferno. I lifted my head to look and immediately wished I hadn't. The entire village center was engulfed in a massive fireball that reached hundreds of feet into the sky. German soldiers ran in all directions, many of them on fire. Tanks tried to reverse away from the flames, only to be caught as fuel tanks ruptured and added to the conflagration. The heat was so intense that snow was melting in a 100-yard radius, turning the ground to mud and steam, and I was trapped on the wrong side of the fire. Flames surrounded my position on 3 sides, driven by wind and fed by a seemingly endless supply of fuel. The stone wall that had saved me from the initial blast was now a prison, holding me in as temperatures climbed past anything survivable. My lungs burned with every breath. My uniform began to smoke. Through the wall of fire, I could see the ridge where my squad was positioned. I could see them retreating, using the chaos to escape as I'd hoped. Frank stood at the tree line, staring down at the inferno, probably certain I was already dead. Maybe he was right. The flames closed in, and I realized I had maybe seconds before I was overcome. The heat was unbearable, cooking me alive even behind the stone. My vision started to blur, darkness creeping in at the edges. This was it. This was how I died, alone in a Belgian village, surrounded by fire, having given my squad the chance they needed. I thought of home, of my mother's face, of the girl I'd loved in high school who'd promised to wait for me. Would they tell her how I died? Would they find enough of me to send home? The darkness grew, the fire roared, and Staff Sergeant James Mitchell prepared to meet whatever came next. But something in me refused to quit. Even as my body screamed in agony, even as the flames licked at my position, some stubborn core of will wouldn't let go. I'd survived everything the Germans had thrown at us for 3 days. I'd survived wounds that should have killed weaker men. I'd survived odds that seemed impossible. I could survive this. I tore off my smoldering jacket and wrapped it around my head, leaving just enough gap to see through. Then I looked at the wall of flames, searching for weakness. There, to the right, where the fire seemed slightly less intense, where the wind had created a temporary gap in the inferno. It was maybe 3 feet wide and shrinking by the second. I didn't let myself think. Thinking would mean recognizing how impossible this was. Instead, I burst from behind the wall at a full sprint, heading straight for that gap. The heat hit me like a hammer. My wrapped jacket immediately began to burn, flames licking at the fabric. I felt my hair singe, smelled my own flesh cooking. The pain was beyond description, beyond anything I'd experienced in months of combat. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to drop and roll, to do anything but keep running through hell itself. But I kept going. 3 steps through the flames felt like 3 miles. Time stretched and distorted, each moment an eternity of agony. I saw German soldiers staring at me in shock, their faces illuminated by the fire consuming their position. I heard someone scream. Might have been me, might have been them. Then I was through, falling to my knees in the snow on the far side of the flames. The cold felt like salvation, like the most blessed relief imaginable. I tore the burning jacket from my head and buried my face in the snow, feeling the moisture sizzle against my burned skin. "Holy Christ," someone said in English. "He's alive!" Hands grabbed me, dragging me further from the fire. I looked up to see Private Morrison's soot-stained face, his eyes wide with something like religious awe. "Sarge, we saw you go in. We saw the explosion. You should be dead. You should be..." He couldn't finish, just stared at me like I was a ghost. More of my squad appeared, emerging from the tree line where they'd taken cover. Frank reached me first, dropping to his knees beside me with tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his face. "You crazy son of a bitch," he said, his voice breaking. "You walked through fire. I saw you. The flames were everywhere and you just walked through them." I wanted to tell him it wasn't that simple, that I'd nearly died, that I'd gotten lucky beyond any reasonable expectation. But my throat was too raw, my voice too weak. Instead, I just nodded, letting them help me to my feet. Behind us, the German assault had collapsed into chaos. The fuel depot continued to burn, sending thick black smoke into the grey sky. Enemy forces were in full retreat, unable to maintain their momentum with their supply line destroyed. The Americans, what was left of our battered company, had held. Captain Sullivan found us an hour later as medics worked on my burns. They were surprisingly minor given what I'd been through. Second-degree burns on my face and hands, singed hair, smoke inhalation. Painful, but survivable. The medics kept shaking their heads, murmuring about miracles and impossible luck. "Mitchell," Sullivan said, his voice formal despite the emotion in his eyes. "What you did down there saved this company, maybe saved the entire defensive line. I'm putting you in for a medal. Just doing my job, sir. That wasn't your job. That was..." He paused, searching for words. "That was beyond anything I've seen in 3 years of combat. You walked through fire that should have killed you instantly. Men are already talking about what they saw. They're calling it impossible. It was necessary," I said simply. "They needed a chance to get out. I gave it to them." Over the following days, as the Battle of the Bulge raged across the Ardennes, our story spread through the unit and beyond. Soldiers who'd been at other parts of the line came to see the man who'd walked through flames. Some wanted to shake my hand. Others just wanted to look at me, as if confirming I was real. Danny couldn't stop talking about it, describing the scene to anyone who'd listen. "I'm telling you, the fire was everywhere. 100-foot flames, smoke thick as fog. Then this figure just emerges from it, walking like the flames weren't even there. I thought I was seeing things, thought the cold had made me hallucinate. But it was Sarge. He walked through hell itself and came out the other side. Frank was quieter about it, but I caught him watching me sometimes with an expression I couldn't quite read. Finally, one evening, as we huddled around a small fire in a temporary camp behind the lines, he spoke up. "I've been thinking about what happened," he said, "about how you made it through those flames. The temperature in a fuel fire like that can reach over 2,000 degrees. The smoke alone should have choked you unconscious in seconds, but you came through with burns you could get from touching a hot stove. What's your point, Frank?" "My point is that it doesn't make sense. None of it makes sense." He met my eyes across the fire. "I'm not saying it was a miracle or divine intervention or anything like that. I don't know what it was. But I saw you go in and I saw you come out, and those two things shouldn't have been possible for the same person." I didn't have an answer for him. I'd replayed those moments in my mind 1,000 times, trying to understand how I'd survived. The gap in the flames had been there, that much was real. The jacket had provided some protection. I'd been fast, maybe faster than I'd ever moved in my life. But was it enough to explain walking through an inferno that had killed dozens of German soldiers caught in the same blast? I didn't know. I'd stopped trying to figure it out. What I did know was that my squad had survived. We'd held the line when it mattered most. And whatever had happened in those flames, whatever impossible thing I'd done had given my brothers the chance they needed. The Battle of the Bulge continued for weeks, the Germans throwing everything they had into their last great offensive. Our depleted company was rotated to a quieter sector to recover and receive replacements. New faces filled the gaps left by fallen friends, young soldiers fresh from training who looked at us veterans with a mixture of respect and fear. They'd heard the stories about the stand in the Ardennes, about the sergeant who'd walked through fire. I tried to downplay it, to focus on training the new men and preparing for the battles still to come. But the story had taken on a life of its own. Officers from other units wanted detailed reports of what had happened. War correspondents showed up asking for interviews. Even a colonel from division headquarters made a special visit to meet the man the Germans couldn't burn. It made me uncomfortable, all that attention. I was just a soldier doing my job. Others had done things just as brave, had taken risks just as foolish. The only difference was that I'd survived when I shouldn't have. But maybe that was enough. In late January, as the German offensive finally collapsed and Allied forces began pushing them back, Captain Sullivan called me to his headquarters tent. Inside, I found him with several other officers, including Major General Ridgway himself. "Sergeant Mitchell," Ridgway said, returning my salute. "I've read the reports of your actions on December 18th. Quite extraordinary. Your commanding officer has recommended you for the Distinguished Service Cross." "Sir, I was just doing your job," he interrupted with a slight smile. "Yes, that's what all the brave ones say. But what you did went far beyond duty, son. You recognized a critical target, executed an attack with no regard for your own safety, and then accomplished something that multiple witnesses have described as impossible. You walked through flames that killed enemy soldiers on contact. You emerged on the other side and continued fighting. That kind of courage, that kind of determination, that's what wins wars." He pinned the medal on my chest himself, a small piece of bronze and ribbon that felt impossibly heavy. The other officers saluted. Outside the tent, my squad had gathered to watch, and they broke into cheers when I emerged. Frank was the first to reach me, grabbing my hand in both of his. "You earned it, Jimmy. God knows you earned it." "We all earned it," I said, looking at the faces around me. "Every man who stood on that ridge, who held when any sane person would have run. We earned it together." Danny grinned, his young face still bearing the hardness that came from surviving impossible odds. "Yeah, but you're the one who walked through the fire, Sarge. That's something special. That's something we'll be telling our grandkids about." The war ground on through February and March, pushing deeper into Germany. Our company saw more action, more losses, more moments of terror and bravery. But something had changed after the Ardennes. The men fought with a different kind of confidence, a belief that we could survive anything. After all, we'd held against impossible odds. We'd seen one of our own walk through flames and emerge alive. If that was possible, what couldn't we do? I never forgot those moments in the fire, the heat, the pain, the absolute certainty that I was going to die. And then the impossible, the gap in the flames, the desperate sprint, the emergence into cold air and snow that felt like rebirth. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I'd look at my hands and remember how they'd burned, how the flames had licked at my skin. The scars were minor, barely visible, but I felt them every day, a reminder of the line between life and death, of how thin that margin could be. Years later, long after the war ended and I returned home to build a normal life, People would still ask me about it. How did you survive? What was it like? Were you afraid? I'd tell them the truth. I was terrified. Every second of it was absolute terror. But fear doesn't mean you stop moving, stop fighting, stop trying to survive. Fear just means you understand the stakes. As for how I survived, I never found a satisfying answer. Maybe it was luck, pure and simple. Maybe the fire wasn't as hot as it seemed, the gap wider than I remembered. Maybe my protective jacket worked better than anyone expected. Or maybe, in that moment of absolute desperation, I tapped into something deeper than conscious thought, some primal survival instinct that allowed me to do the impossible. I don't know, I'll probably never know. What I do know is that I walked into fire on December 18th, 1944, expecting to die. And I walked out the other side, burned but alive, having given my brothers the chance they needed to survive. That's enough. That has to be enough. The war ended in May 1945. Our company was among the first to cross the Rhine, to push into the heart of Germany, to witness the collapse of the Nazi regime. We lost more men, saw more horrors, experienced more moments of terror and triumph. But nothing quite matched those days in the Ardennes, when we'd held against everything the Germans could throw at us. And nothing matched the moment when I emerged from the flames, proving to my squad and to myself that sometimes, through courage or desperation or pure stubborn refusal to die, a man could survive the impossible. They called me the man who walked through fire. I was just a sergeant trying to save his squad. But if my story gave them hope, if it made them believe they could survive anything, then walking through that inferno was worth every second of pain, because that's what soldiers do. We stand when retreat makes more sense. We fight when the odds say we should surrender, and sometimes when there's no other choice, we walk through fire itself to protect our brothers. I did it once, in a frozen Belgian village in December 1944. Given the same circumstances, knowing the pain and terror that awaited me in those flames, I'd do it again without hesitation. That's not heroism. That's not some special courage that sets me apart. That's just being a soldier, being part of something bigger than yourself, being willing to sacrifice everything for the men who depend on you. The fire burned. I survived. My squad made it out. In the end, that's all that matters. The rest is just a story people tell, growing more embellished with each retelling. But the core truth remains. When it mattered most, when my brothers needed a miracle, I gave them everything I had, and somehow, impossibly, it was enough.